Hi, I'm McCown, and in this video tutorial series, we're going to be covering how to create SQL tables in Access and SQL Server, migrating those tables from Access into SQL Server, and then manipulating those tables through ASP.NET. However, before we begin all that, I'd like to take a few minutes to explain the front-end back-end concepts on which ASP.NET is based. Another name for front-end back-end is client-server, which is referring to a program where there's a front-end that shows the user the GUI interface where all the data is input, and a backend, where all the processing is actually done and data is sent to and from the front-end GUI interface. However, front-end backend can be applied to several different things other than websites. Start off by defining what front-end is. Front-end is the input side of a system. This is where the graphical user interface, or GUI, is set up and data is often entered. An example of this is a front-end computer that is set up to filter another more powerful but yet less user-friendly machine. Another example of this is a GUI interface over an already existing yet not really user-friendly protocol. A perfect example of this would be an FTP program such as Fetch. The FTP protocol already exists and can be executed through a Unix shell. However, it's not that user-friendly because it's a command line program. What Fetch does, Fetch is a graphic user interface that executes FTP commands through mouse clicks on the interface. This front end is just a dummy interface because it doesn't actually do anything. No data is processed. The back end are the actual FTP protocols that are executed on events sent from the front end. The back end is defined by the processes that are not seen by the user. A perfect example of this is ASP itself. Another back end example is a compiler such as Visual Studio. The front end of this would be your programming languages such as C++, Visual Basic, C#, any number of those. When your code is compiled, that's where your back end comes into play. Your back end takes that programming language code and converts it to the actual machine language and performs optimization specific to the machine architecture for whatever computer that you're on. Likewise, the front end generates the P code or the pseudocode that allows the user to see the program code at runtime for debugging purposes. One of the most common examples of front-end back-end are your operating systems. For example, a GUI file manager such as Windows Explorer or Mac Finder is the front end of your file system. The command line or text user interface that actually processes and executes the commands from the front end is considered to be your back end. This same concept applies to software packages such as Microsoft Office and SQL Server Management Studio. Now, the point of all this is to give you an introduction to the concepts on which ASP.NET is built. ASP is an open source programming language, and to give you a little background on it, it was first introduced in 1996 in the IIS 3.0 package. One of the biggest things ASP has got going for it is its use of objects. There are 6 main objects in ASP.NET, and each object corresponds with frequently used functions. To give you an example of 2 of them, the response object is used to send data from the server to the HTML page. This is where you get your response.write, which is equivalent to console.writeline or cout. This function allows data to be written from the back end to the front end. The other example is the request object. The request object is the opposite of that. The request object is the front end requesting data from the back end. A good example of this is if you pass a variable through your URL, you use your request.queryString in order to get that variable out of the URL. Because ASP is integrated with Visual Studio, it has a major advantage over several of the other dynamic web languages. This advantage is its use of controls. Controls are pre-made objects that can be as simple as a button or a text field, or they can be as complicated as a data source or a crystal report, which generates reports from your data source. Another major advantage of this integration with Visual Studio is the ability to debug your code while running your website. Another strength of ASP.NET is its use of the .NET framework. The .NET framework allows for abstraction markup. Whether your page is called in Internet Explorer, Firefox, or even a mobile phone, your markup abstraction takes care of the various HTML markups needed to render it in this browser. In other dynamic web languages, this markup abstraction has to be done by the programmer. In addition to all these advantages that I've just listed for ASP, the biggest advantage ASP has going for it is its use of front-end back-end. When an ASP web form is created, two files are actually made. The first file is your front end. It is the .aspx file that is sent to your client's machine. When you place dynamic content on a .aspx page, they're placed between these active code tags. However, Microsoft frowns on this practice except for purposes of data binding, because the more active code tags you have on your .aspx page, the more calls are going to be made to your server, and the longer it's going to take the page to be rendered out on the front end. The second page that gets created when you create a new web form in ASP is the .aspx.vb, where .vb is whatever your programming language you're using. It could be .cpp or .cs. If there's an on-page load event, it's activated when the client requests to view the page. All the processes and functions are done, and if necessary, data is sent to the .aspx front-end page. However, this page never leaves the server. This front-end back-end method makes programming much simpler and also reduces the amount of active content that is sent to the client machine. The more active content that has to be resolved on the .aspx page, the longer it's going to take the client browser to render out the final page. This back-end method of deploying your dynamic content allows for faster render times in the client's browser. That's an introduction to ASP.NET and kind of an overview of the biggest advantages of using it. The remainder of this video series will actually focus on using ASP.NET with SQL databases. In video 2, Lewis will show you how to create SQL tables in both Access and on SQL Server, and two methods of moving that data from Access onto the SQL Server.